Hey there everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Joe. If you've not been here before, welcome. And today we're going to be discussing a pretty hot topic when it comes to Final Fantasy TCG, and that's going to be fire. Now fire is, been seen as one of the weaker elements in the game for Final Fantasy TCG for quite a while now, and I wanted to quickly go into the reasons as to why people might feel this way, and also reasons as to why I feel that fire is still, perfectly viable as a reliable tournament deck, and the things that they could do to improve it. Now the reason that I wanted to go into this, because I've tried to build mono fire numerous times and I have struggled with it, though I've noticed that certainly in Japan it does a lot better than it does in a lot of other places. And I was also inspired by a deck that I saw at the Grand Open for London that we did fairly recently, as it was very, very unconventional fire, and I think that it inspired me to kind of look into the intricacies of what fire can do that people don't necessarily look at. Now, quickly going over some of the better things about fire, because I did want to lead with a positive note. I think that fire has some of the greatest kind of answer and reactive cards that the game has available at the moment. A great example of this would be a card like Vivi, who at 3 CP comes in, provides a body, and more than likely eliminates something much bigger than he is, and I think that he's kind of like a benchmark for kind of reactive plays. And you also have some really, really powerful forwards at the higher end of the CP spectrum on 5-drops, like Emperor Xander, who is a persistent threat and also does something when he leaves, and that means that he's very, very difficult to answer himself. However, we're now going to go into some of the negative things about fire, and one of the biggest glaring weaknesses that fire has is a lack of consistency. Fire has next to no search cards whatsoever, and the ones it does have are very, very specific. I'm referring to cards like Zangan, who can search for Tifa, or Selfie, who can search for CD candidates, of which there are not many. I think Zell is realistically the only one that actually sees any play currently. And I think that if Fire were to get a more well-rounded searcher, I mean, if we got a Fire Final Fantasy II searcher, it would blow that deck wide open, because Firion and Guy are both very, very good cards that are, as I've stated earlier, kind of really strong value plays. I mean, if that searcher happened to be a Rebel as well, then that would be amazing, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. And then one of the things that I do actually like about Fire is that its abilities and summons are usually indiscriminate. That means that it doesn't matter what the state of the board is, they can be used on a forward almost all the time. So for example, taking Brynhilda as an example, it deals 7,000 damage. It doesn't say that the forward has to be active, it doesn't say that the forward has to be dull, it doesn't say that the forward has to be of a certain element, it doesn't say that it works on things that have already been damaged, it just does damage. It's simple, but that's one of the best things that Fire has going for it. Now, my other biggest problem with Fire, honestly, is the fact that all the cards that I stated that are really, really strong tend to be reactive plays. There aren't many plays within Fire that benefit the player. So, for example, in Water, you have cards like Viking or, Layla, things like that, that are establishing a board presence regardless of what your opponent is doing. And then Ice has things like Thaumaturge, which provide a body and have an ability that's always going to be useful in discarding a card from your opponent's hand. Cards like Vivi are amazing. However, they require a forward to be on your opponent's board before you can actually use them effectively. So your opponent is already establishing a board presence before you're able to establish your own with any kind of effective, value. So I think that Fire needs to have a few more cards that are kind of self-sufficient and don't rely on what your opponent is doing. And a card that I did want to talk about actually to do with this is a card that's been spoiled recently, and that's 5CP Jekt. And now Jekt, I think, is a good card. I'm not going to dispute that. I really like the fact that he devalues himself and he takes himself down to 1 CP for 9k, and he can deal damage to your opponent in a way that's not conventional. However, the problem I have with Jekt, and a lot of what Fire does, is that he requires you essentially to be behind your opponent before you can actually play him. Now, being a 5CP 9k, you're not going to play that, and there's only so many 5CP slots that you can take, and Xander almost always takes that slot in a mono Fire deck. So, while I like Jekt, I think it would be really difficult to find room for him amongst all this wide variety of 5CP Fire cards, which is, there are too many of them, to be honest. There are too many cards in Fire that cost way much way more than the value you get out of trying to build up to playing them. So where Wind, for example, can play loads of cards that can activate your backups, or make it so that your cards are more valuable. Lightning even has Louis Soir and Alphanord, which is a backup searching for a backup, and then you also have Zemus, who is a proactive play, because the longer he stays on the board, the more value he accrues. Fire doesn't really have many cards like that. Like, Sabin is probably the closest thing you've got to that, and he does have a searcher, but again, it's very specific because it's Edgar, and, he doesn't actually push the board further. He just stops you from being, broken, and therefore making it harder for your guys to fall behind. Sabin is still an amazing card. Absolutely. Very, very strong card. But the point I'm making is that Fire as a whole seems to be cards that try and prevent you from losing rather than pushing you toward winning. And I think that that's a big problem for it. Now, all of this is reliant on the fact that we're talking about the conventional mono Fire decks that a lot of people have been playing since, well, Opus 3-ish sort of time. But there are a lot of cards in Fire that do very, very well in very unconventional ways. Like Godot from Opus 5, or Opus, is it Opus 5 or Opus 6? It is Opus 5, there we go, I just wanted to double check that. He is quite a proactive card. So you have Lebro and Luneth, who obviously grant power buffs across the board, but every colour kind of has that. Whereas Godot can do it in such a way that is pushing the game forward, because haste in this game is actually very, very powerful. So if you've got a card like Godot that can push haste onto things like Ledner, who is a presence regardless, and I think he's actually a very, very strong card, you can make it so that you've got these smaller guys that actually get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we've also got cards in Opus 7 coming out, and the new Heroes vs Villain deck. I think that the new Warrior of Light kind of fits into this very, very well, as does Sol, who is also a Warrior of Light. So maybe there's a Fire Warrior of Light deck coming about, where you have kind of just these small guys that are accruing value in a different way than some of the other forwards we've seen in other colours. But they obviously also all require you to have multiple forwards, so removal being such a strong part of Final Fantasy TCG means that that might be difficult to come up with. And by removal, I don't necessarily mean forward removal, I mean like hand removal, or just having much bigger cards to deal with, like Earth. Earth is a great example of a colour that can accrue value very, very quickly by way of things like Star Sibyl and Camlanor. But I think that one thing we've also seen that is also very nice, and it is seeing a lot of play recently, is Vermilion Birdless Sea Katuna. It's not a searcher per se, because it's not actually grabbing anything to your hand like that accumulates board presence. However, it has a lingering effect, and it does provide value in the summons that you pull out of it. Fire actually does have some of the strongest summons in the game, and that, in the form of things like Phoenix. 7 CP Phoenix, obviously not summonable by Katuna, is a massive value card, because, but again, it does require your opponent to have something to burn off before you can really use it. But that being said, you can still get a lot of value out of it, and Phoenix sees a lot of play in multicolour decks, so there's no reason why a forward that can provide really strong value like Vivi could also see play through Phoenix as well. Fire actually also has some of the strongest monsters going, and some of them have actually flown under the radar for quite some time, though I'm really pleased to see that some of them are starting to come into play. We all know that Goblin from Opus 4, which can, break itself so you draw a card and grant haste, is a very strong card. But the other Goblin from Opus 6, that has no activation cost to turn into a forward, and then when it attacks deals 1,000 damage or something, is also very, very strong. I think that I always keep coming back to Vivi here, but I think that cards like this enable Vivi's Firaga ability to actually be really quite relevant, because your monsters are going to dodge that kind of ability while you're still applying pressure in the early game. And I actually really like Goblin. I think it's very, very, very good. We also have Manasvin Warmech, which has so much combo potential, it's crazy. I think that, being able to make something deal 2,000 more damage, if it deals damage repeatedly. Now, this is more common in things like Fire Wind, where you have things like Balthea. You also have, there's a fun combo I've seen that uses Opus 1 Saz backup and No-No, so that you can just repeatedly keep using it to burn your opponent's board. I think it's really, really cool. But I'm going off of a deck list here that I've seen from Japan recently that did top, and I think that some of the cards in here are actually very relevant. So this deck actually uses Ifrits, which I've not seen a huge number of people using these Ifrits, but I think that in combination with Vermilion Birdless Sea Katuna, it can actually do very, very well. And this is the Ifrit that deals 6,000 damage, and the Ifrit that deals 4,000 unless you control 5 or more fire characters, you deal it 7,000 damage instead. Now I would like this card a heck of a lot more if there were more searches within the backup line to get you to that 5 character limit quicker. But I think that that's kind of the bit that we're missing, really, is just that consistency to get to the cards you actually need to, or at least get to that kind of threshold where you can start playing these bigger cards that Fire seems to want you to play. Now I shall leave links in the description box below for you guys who want to look at the decks that I'm referencing here. So as I say, that first deck that I spoke about did really well in Japan, but this one was actually part of the German Grand Open. And in terms of matchups, I think that there are more you can do with Fire than you might think. So against Ice, which obviously uses a lot, and Water for that matter, who use a lot of smaller forwards to accumulate value, things like Cannoneer and Scholar do very, very well in kind of mitigating the amount of board presence your opponent has for little cost. So for example, Scholar will take out Thaumaturges or Vikings with, you know, as long as the Thaumaturges aren't boosted, but if they are, then you still have access to Cannoneer that will always take them out unless they've been boosted elsewhere. And there are only 2 CP backups as well, and 2 CP backups is always something that Fire's had a little bit of a struggle with, because the only ones that see a lot of play are Red Mage, who doesn't really get used all that much anymore because there's very rarely only one forward to prevent blocking, Selfie, who is still good, she still does very, very well, and Black Mage, which can kind of get some damage through. But with this particular deck, this uses Phoenix. It also uses the few searches that Fire has in Zangan and Selfie, as I mentioned previously, but they have very, very specific search targets, namely Zell and Tifa, and this deck is looking to take advantage of, you know, the various kind of bonuses that you can get. So in terms of damage, like you have Emperor Xander, you have Dark Lord, who is another card that I did want to touch on. Dark Lord, when everyone saw it to begin with, were like, oh my god, this card looks terrible. However, it's above curve and it has a persistent effect. So, and if you get one of these down against an Ice deck quickly, then it's something that your opponent's going to have to deal with. And I think that Fire, they're few and far between, but the cards that they have that need to be dealt with quickly can be very difficult to deal with. If you've ever faced down an Emperor Xander in a match, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So honestly, the key I feel to building a solid Fire deck is figuring out which cards provide you the most value for the CP that you're putting into them. Another card that I did want to highlight quickly is Cloud from Opus 3. I'm really surprised that I've not seen this card see play more often, purely because a lot of people run Tifa in their Fire decks, which is an FF7 character. A lot of people run, you know, various different FF7 characters within Fire, but don't necessarily run this Cloud. And I often find that it can be a 9k Brave attacker for 3 CP, and that's actually really quite strong. And even without that, he is providing a secondary source of Selfie's ability, which I really quite like. But I think that having like backups that you can kind of build your board presence while you're still accumulating things. Obviously with Ice Turbo Discard being a thing, cards like VV and Black Bolts aren't quite so powerful because they're not going to deal as much damage because their hand is going to be smaller. But cards like Irvin will still do a decent amount of damage for you to be able to kind of push forward with your deck, and then just kind of, you know, make sure that you're building your resources while stopping your opponent from being over aggressive towards you. It's the funny thing I find with Fire is that Fire seems to want to be this super hyper aggressive colour, and yet none of its cards are proactive. They're all like responding to what your opponent is doing. So it's actually more kind of mid-rangey, I think, than hyper aggressive. Though, as I said earlier, cards like Godot do help that, and I think if you want to take that kind of route, there is definitely an option there for you to do so. Now before I go, I did want to quickly mention the deck that I was actually inspired by in the first place, and this is a deck by Jesse Dyer, who top 16'd at the London Grand Open, and I'll just leave a link in the description box below for you guys to check that out if you want to as well. But the things I wanted to note about it are some really unconventional picks that I think would work really, really well in the current meta. So for example, Royal Ripeness is like a card that not a lot of people really look at because it's quite expensive and it's not Emperor Xander, basically, but because the way, I think that having spoken to him, his fear was cards like the Gullwings and things that can't be targeted. So by having spread damage, just consistent spread damage constantly through things like Royal Ripeness or Scholar, things like that, it means that you've got a lot of small amounts of damage that are doing like a lot of work. And then you've also got Amodar in here, which, having spoken to him, I think you actually can see him in the vlog I made for the Grand Open, but he said that Amodar actually won him a good 60 to 70% of his games. And I can see why, and honestly, I think Amadar's a really, really good pick right now because monsters are in most decks. And being an FF13 forward as well, it's actually quite interesting because next set we've already had a Fang revealed that gets buffed by having various FF13 characters out, and Lebro, who is the fire power booster, is already a Final Fantasy 13 character. So if we start seeing any more FF13, then, I mean, we can pray that an FF13 Searcher comes about for fire, but you could end up seeing a really different style of mono fire that's just really high value forwards under the FF13 banner, and I think that would be really cool. But as I said, like a lot of the, you know, this is very, very cheap cards. You know, it makes use of Godot, it makes use of Ranger, which is another method of using spread damage. Warrior, which makes your guys bigger, and I think would work very well with Godot. Warrior of Light that I mentioned earlier from the Heroes vs Villain deck. You know, there's lots of different ways that you can go about it, and it actually uses backup VV as well instead of forward, which isn't a bad shout actually when you think about it, because as I stated earlier, with things like Irvin doing really well against mono ice, maybe this VV is actually a better pick than the legendary one in some ways. But anyways, that's it for this video. I just kind of wanted to give you guys some ideas on how we solve a problem like mono fire. For you guys in the future. There's loads of Opus 7 cards coming out that will hopefully help the deck elevate itself to the same kind of consistency that the other colours seem to have. And hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video, and hopefully this guy has helped you guys. If you want me to build a mono fire deck for you guys to have a look at, then leave a comment down below and I'll see what I can do. And hopefully I'll probably wait until Opus 7 has come out so that I can like get a feel of all the cards that have come out in that set. But if you want to see that, then let me know. Anyways, thank you ever so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and check out all of the links for my socials below, and I'll speak to you guys soon. See you later.